Hello.
Welcome, welcome, welcome to the stream. Hold on, I'm gonna do a thing, which is my favorite thing to do. Uh, what's the thing? Window, window capture, Discord, source, window. No, oh, there we go. You're here. You're here now.
Yes. Yes, I'm here now.
Perfect. Could you introduce
Everyone.
yourself to my giant audience, the biggest audience that you've ever seen in the history of audiences ever?
Hello, Lucy's chat. You probably already know me. I know I've been on a few times, but I'm Shakespeare or Shakespeare if you prefer. I am a cultural historian. My expertise is in Jewish history and Latin American history. And Lucy and I have spoken a lot about Jewish history, particularly talking about. I mean, the last time I think we spoke about Vilna, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
So yeah, so we're very interested in talking about sort of Jewish culture, particularly in Eastern Europe, and sort of things that have gone on since 1945, but also looking pre 1945 as well. But for today, I know that you wanted to particularly speak about the UNO or the ONU and the UPA, right?
It's OUN.
Oh, UN. There we go. That's right.
Yeah, it actually perfectly translates from Polish to Ukrainian to English because it's Organizacja Ukraińskich Nacjonalistów, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. So
Okay.
the thing stays the same and it translates perfectly to many different languages.
Okay.
So
So
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yes. I wanted to know if you would like to sort of give us a quick introduction, sort of like why you're sort of interested in these organizations.
Oh,
Like,
I've already sort of giving a quick roundup that
okay,
there's like a tension right now between Poland and uh, Ukraine because there was an event during which the Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs was asked when will Ukraine allow Poland to do an exhumation of the victims of the Volyn massacre, to which the uh, minister has said that there was Operation Vistula and that he has nothing against exhumation, but it has to be a two-way street. Ukrainian victims should also be commemorated, and that history should be left to the historians, and that we should be building our future together as politicians, as people.
right. And so,
It created
mhm.
outrage within Polish politics and a lot of public opinion. Uh, Prime Minister of Poland basically said that without our okay, Ukraine will not be able to join the European Union, and if Ukraine cannot sort of sort its stance on history with Poland, then we will not be able to give that okay. I've already sort of given today my opinion that I believe that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Radosław Sikorski, has given the most sort of balanced and um, I would say reasonable response that these sort of things always go both ways. It's never a one-way street. And this is basically my stance as well, that these sort of things should be built on mutual respect, on mutual talks, rather than on Poland trying to brute force sort of things by saying we're gonna block your way into the European Union until we get what we want. That is a
which I
TLDR basically of what's been going on between Poland and Ukraine lately.
Yeah, and I totally agree that I think it's wrong to of all things, especially Ukraine, with all that it has suffered thus far, right? To say that Poland, which I think of all countries should know, the sort of the horrors, I guess, of sort of being in between, right? Like Central and Western Europe, and then also you have like particularly like the Russian Empire in history, and also hello LFNF, welcome in, FLFNF, welcome in. That to say that we would keep you out unless essentially, I mean it's political extortion, right? And it's doing it using the the victims of a horrific event. Now, one thing I'm gonna bring on screen really quickly is this map that sort of shows the terrain. So it's so this is from an academic thing. It's actually from Poland, from Zalachniki is the name. Professor Zalachniki. He's at I believe the University of Lublin. And so this area here, which again,
where are you showing it?
On stream.
Oh, can you show it to me somehow so that I can show it?
Yeah. Just here, 1 second. Okay, I sent it over. It's just loading.
Oh.
There you go. So, Volhynia, this is an area that you can see here, right? Was made up of many different nationalities, right? And the area I'm particularly wanting us to focus on is the area that the professor focused on, right? Is that and also the colors of each city also tells you what was the majority nationality. Now I'm a bit and I don't know about how you would feel about this, Lucy. I mean, because you're also Jewish, but I always found it weird how like in all of these maps they never include like Jewish as a nationality, although they claim that Jewish is a nationality. But
I'm not a fan of listing Jewish as a nationality, but a lot of the Polish sources will show, because Jewish people were listed in data on
right.
On what people lived in what cities, and I know that in both Lviv and Vilnius, Jewish people were actually a pretty substantial percentage of the population.
Yeah, especially during the Austro-Hungarian area when it was still Lemberg as it was known then. So looking at this map here, you see that this area here, that sort of, I know it's like a weird gray that sort of cuts through the green but this is the area where the massacres happened, right? That goes from, and again, please do correct. I have been studying somewhat on my own, with the Polish, but I am definitely wont to make mistakes. So Łuk, Stanisław, and Lvov, right? So these, and again, I'm just saying them in the way how they're written here. And so these are the major cities, along with Tarnopol, right, which was the other larger city where they had. And these cities here that are in black are the cities that are of Jewish majority. So I want to make that very clear for the audience. And so this is where these massacres took place. And this is what this division between Ukraine and Poland now is discussing, right? Or what it's sort of based in, right? Yeah. Is that they want to exhume bodies in Ukraine. The Polish government wants to exhume bodies on the Ukrainian side, but they wanted to essentially be a quid pro quo, right? But in a way that, in my view, is, especially the way how you were describing it, sounds very extortion-like, right? Like, we will not let you into the concert of Europe, quote unquote, right? To
Yes.
say it as the, if you don't do it, right? Whereas Ukraine is saying, we're willing to do it as long as, we, it's there's some reciprocity.
Yes, there's like this commemoration of Ukrainian victims because, of course, the numbers were different. That there's been this retaliation of Polish people against Ukrainian people. Yeah, I think 2 to 3,000 Ukrainian civilians were murdered, and I think this sort of thing should also be discussed. Even though you could, I mean, an argument could be made that 100,000 people versus 2 or 3,000 people is that one is much bigger, but then we would have to enter the conversation of being a numbers game, etc. So I just think
Right.
that it's a reasonable request from Ukraine to ask Poland to sort of also commemorate those historical events that have affected the Ukrainian population. Yeah.
Right. It's especially in this time, and I need to really get off the go back to what I was looking at earlier because I don't want to. But yes, so if you would elaborate a little bit, kind of how then these two organizations played their part in this context, right, and
Well, they're
why
basically
they are.
in reality one organization, right? The
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists simply had like this military branch which took part in. It is said that some of them took part in the extermination of Jewish people, which became sort of a blueprint on how Polish people would be killed, purged from the land, because OUN as well as UPA sort of were part of this thing that some people claimed historically that it was the so-called integrated nationalism. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term integrated nationalism.
Well, I mean, I'm familiar with the concept, yes, for sure.
Okay. And then newer historiography decided no, it's actually not integrated nationalism because, for one, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists didn't really want to establish any form of monarchy, which was a bit a part of the whole integrated nationalism. They were
Right.
more fascistic, and then there's this whole discussion of what fascism is, how it applies to organizations, and because you have fascistic organizations and you have fascistic regimes, fascistic organizations can become fascistic regimes, and then you had the whole evolution of what fascism is perceived to be, and then you have the whole discussion of how the communist bloc sort of from the 20s to the 30s have basically called any and all opponents fascists because they sort of, even different types of socialists were called fascists because they did not exactly agree on what type of government should be brought about. Piłsudski was called a fascist because he used to be a socialist and he did not live up to the socialist idea, and he was not a fan of the Soviet Union.
Right, and then you also of course have that quote of the gosh, why is his name escaping me now? Of the Italian socialist who wrote the
You're too loud.
prison
I'm
letter.
gonna try to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who wrote the prison letters? I don't know why his name is escaping me. I should know his name. I have his book. It's like right over just past my computer, but he famously said something very negatively attributing Trotsky, right, as being associated with fascism, right? And that also has existed itself as a meme. Hello, Atticus among us. Gramsci, thank you so much. Gramsci famously said something along the lines of like Trotsky is the bitch of fascism, like right, like I mean, just to say exactly the quote, but like ever since that, like a lot of people who were um um any of the people that were that that are sort of more of the kind of well, like a apologist for the Soviet Union, right? I mean, I don't like to give them the typical term that people like to give them because I think it's kind of overused and it doesn't really, help us in describing, different groups of people. But I definitely think that like the apologist for like the Soviet Union once it was in its revisionist phase, um, love to bring up that quote, and I've seen memes of it, right? Oh, what like oh, Europe or the world if Trotsky instead of Stalin would have won out or something, and it shows like the whole world falling to the Axis powers or something. So
And of course, there's the Joseph Stalin himself famously saying that Sogdems are basically soft fascists. So, you know, there's a whole topic to be had. There's a whole discussion to be had. But yes, bringing us back to the OUN and UPA, which actually had a few different branches. OUN B, OUN M, and UPA, different sort of military units that took part in the massacres, because there were the Volyn massacres, of course, not the only massacres. Like there's like this umbrella term for both the I believe, gosh, what was the other? One moment. It's very late. It's 4 a.m.
yes, and again, my apologies.
No,
As I
no, it's
told
okay.
chat.
It's okay. It's okay. Okay. It's yes. That's there's there's the Volyn massacre, and then you have the Galicia one. Yes. Lviv, Tarnopol, Stanislavov. And so you have the joint name, the Volyn Galicia massacre. That's the joint name for both these massacres. Yes.
Right. And one thing to note is that these two regions are known for their very high concentration of Jewish people.
Yes.
Right. So like in terms of Jewish history, like these two regions, especially like I mean, when I like Galicia is one of those regions that like in fact, I think if I remember correctly, Fiddler on the Roof takes place in a village in Galicia.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, even one of the most popular, sort of Jewish
Yes.
pop culture references takes place in this area.
And also
So
one of the
for
most hated references within the Jewish community, but that's neither here nor there.
yeah, that's true. That's yes, of course. But
yes.
so I guess how do you feel that the legacies of these nationalist organizations affect, I guess, how we are to um, think about this particular time in question?
Well, it becomes a pretty complicated topic because OUN and UPA are represent two a lot of Polish this sort of hurt, this sort of genocide that happened during World War II. But also, on the other hand, to Ukrainian people themselves, they sort of represent this anti-Soviet Union movement, if you will, and
Right.
it's more used nowadays as this sort of symbol of fighting the oppression of the Soviet Union, and by extension now of representing, in the context of the current conflict, Russian imperialism. That is mostly how these things are utilized now, and that is something that for many Polish people is difficult to grasp when calls are being made to remove certain symbols and certain language from use. And
Mhm.
on the other hand, we also have those tensions that happen, like they did now, between Poland and Ukraine when it comes to the exhumation and uh, joint
Yeah.
history.
Yeah. Someone in chat is saying that we should also, and again, someone in chat, there is a deep history of anti-communists just being straight up Nazis. So what would we, how do we deal with something like that, I guess, because of the fact that, you know, in many cases, especially um, like when you have a figure like Bandera, etc., right? And again, I want to make this very clear for my chat, especially like when we're talking about these historical figures, right? I mean, I don't, I of course, there's that meme, oh, they were a complicated historical figure, but like, yes, literally, they were a complicated historical figure, right? Like, this is not something to tread lightly with. So, in since you brought up like sort of the anti-Soviet Union aspects, I guess I want to
Oh, that was
bring
of
that.
Piłsudski. I'm the anti-Soviet, the anti-communism aspect of the character of Stepan Bandera would have to be. I will have to explore that more because I'm not sure if he was. He was more about the establishment of the Ukrainian nation in a specific form rather
Mhm.
than his politics being mainly about anti-communism or anti-Soviet Union, especially
Right,
since
right,
his movement started out in the Second Polish Republic, so-called. So he was also very preoccupied with uh, fighting against the Polish government, as it were,
right.
and he was
Because
arrested. It's important to also remember that Stepan Bandera spent most of his career, quote unquote, in various jails, and that he was not even present for most of the massacres that occurred during the World War II.
right, and again, I think also emphasizing that at that time, that northwestern part of Ukraine was split up among many other countries, one of which was Poland. Um, because like part of it, like a small part of it was part of Hungary, a small part of it was part of Romania, et cetera, et cetera. But going back to like the idea that like
It all comes back
um
uh, to the failed alliance that Poland had with Ukraine for a short time during the Polish-Soviet War of Petlura, I believe, with Piłsudski.
Right. And so I guess to sort of address the chatter's question, like what do we do then to address the fact that there is that deep history of like anti-communism and, you know, fascism slash Nazism being, that the Venn diagram of those two are very, very nearly a circle, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you wanted to answer?
Oh no, no. I wanted to ask you like what like particularly since you live in Poland and since you visited Ukraine, right? It's like, how do you feel that people can manage, right? Like dealing with what I think is on in some being anti-Russian imperialism, right? Which I don't think any person would be, so to speak, like any leftist would be against, at least
right?
ostensibly speaking, right? But then it's like then the question does come like, well, what happens when you're reviving the symbols of the OUN or the UPA, right? And I think that's kind of what the chatter is getting at is like, well, at what point do you cross the line into being anti-Russian imperialism and into, extremes form of nationalism?
Well, I don't think there's an easy way to answer this. I think that that's
Of course.
for the because of course you're going to have nationalism emerging during a crisis such as this. Like it's going to unite the people against a common enemy that is quite literally invading them. What's important is what sort of shape this sort of nationalism will take, and I am quite happy to report that in many cases, of course, there are exceptions. There's still sort of right wing elements exist. There do exist radical, even Nazi-esque elements, but I would say that they are not in any significant number. You can even see some people that have interviewed the right sector, the people from the right sector or Kraken. But I would say that from what I have witnessed, the type of nationalism or even patriotism that is shaping in Ukraine, I guess it is called political nationalism, which is a form of nationalism that does not emphasize uh, ethnicity as being a necessary component of being part of a nation. It's more like if you live here, if you sort of consider yourself Ukrainian, if you consider yourself part of this Ukrainian project, so to speak, then you are welcome into the nation, so to speak, which is a far better version of the idea than the ethnicity based nationalism, which was represented by radical movements such as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and by extension UPA, is a very good counter to that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
And
happy to
so,
report that it is winning. I think it won a long time ago, actually, historically speaking.
yes. Yeah, like a more, I guess, as people would say in the United States, like a more civic nationalism, right? Like
Yes,
if you uphold the ideals of the United States,
yes,
then it doesn't matter if your family came over in the Mayflower or they just, are recent, Haitian immigrants, etc., right? Like
yes.
it's this idea, right? Yeah. So then speaking to the current controversy, right? How has that history played out, I guess, in these kind of discussions? Because I guess what I want to make sure that we can that sort of we can address is the fact that like Poland has become more and more and more conservative over time,
Yes, of
right?
course, the
Like
course has been reversing a bit with the loss of the Law and Justice Party in the recent parliamentary election, and more center sort of, uh, and even left wing parties have gone to have entered the parliament in a coalition that is now ruling the country.
right. But a lot of this like I guess like the conservatism within Poland, right? That sort of exists or that is acceptable, right, at a certain limit throughout the country. Some would argue, again, I'm not making this argument, but that it is at a higher threshold than in other countries, right? Like say France or Germany, for example. Um, how does that play into the sort of I don't want to say rivalry because I don't want to. I try
Rivalry.
not to. I try not to say that Ukraine and Poland have a rivalry, because I don't think that that's really. I don't think that that's how they operate with one another. Like that they're rivals in that way.
Rivals
Uh,
in what? I don't.
like like in the sense that Poland will try to leverage its influence in Ukraine, right, to, or what's happening in Ukraine right now, right, to get concessions from, say, the European Union or things like that, right?
Well, I would have expected that more from the Law and Justice Party, but thankfully it does not seem to be the case with the now ruling coalition. It's more like uh, the current government is trying to, in my opinion, in a moment of outrage that is a bit over exaggerated, trying to sort of brute force its way into getting historical concessions from Ukraine, which is, in my opinion, a very bad way of creating a long-term relationship with a neighbor.
Hmm. So then, I guess, what would, in your opinion, be the way to, I guess, try to mend that bridge, right? Like, okay, we've already had um, this falling out, so to speak, right? Because of this. And again, like in my opinion, I would feel that, like, as a historian, right? I mean, I would want there to be, right, all of the research necessary, right, so we can know more of the victims, know more of the, the villages that were destroyed, etc., right? Like try to get, for as a historian, right? And etc. But I also understand that, like, both countries, Ukraine and Poland, right, do have to balance the fact that uh, some might see one country as an aggressor, right? Particularly because of the history, right, of that land being, one that has been ruled over by many different, particularly imperial powers, right, like Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc. But also in this case, like Poland, right? So
Well, that's not really an issue considering that Poland has normalized. That is something that the Polish opposition has been preparing for before the fall of communism in Poland. That is something that has been discussed, that has been very instrumental actually in the rise of Ukraine as we know it now, when the famous Paris Culture magazine, there's sort of Paris Cultura Paryska. Um, we can actually learn this from one of Timothy Snyder's lectures. That is a very famous
yeah.
thing in Poland, Kultura Paryska. The opposition that have invited, I've actually had some of these issues in my house. Um, they invited the cooperation of Ukrainian writers, poets, and also have heavily pushed for accepting that the borders are as they are. Lviv is Ukrainian, those terrains are Ukrainian, and that the integrity of Ukraine and that the independence of Ukraine is the only way that Poland itself can also be independent and free. And this sort of thing has been done before even Ukraine has gained its independence. This normalization of when Poland did its roundtable talks, when there was the first semi free election, the new government was formed. Uh, Poland did the first thing that Poland did after being sort of freed from the United Workers' Party It normalized the borders with Ukraine while it was still within the borders of the USSR. Poland did sort of this sneaky, smart thing because Poland
Mhm.
basically was anticipating that the USSR would dissolve, and it wanted
Mhm.
the newly emerging Ukraine to not have to deal with border disputes with Poland. So Poland preemptively normalized the border with Ukraine while it was still Soviet Ukraine.
Right. Um, and I have another sort of like comment from Chad as well, saying my impression is that Poland has been distancing themselves from Russia, but don't want to be invaded or be used as a pawn, therefore are walking a fine line, wishing they could cross the fence without retribution. What do you think concerning that?
Well, I think there's also the sometimes unfortunate, sometimes fortunate fact that Poland is part of NATO, Poland is part of a broader coalition, and cannot just simply act on its own accord. Whatever Poland would do would be considered an action of NATO, of the European Union, not just of Poland.
Right. And so do you, I guess, one other thing, I guess one aspect about that actually brings up another question then is considering, this dispute is how would how would they even, because I feel that in some way people can, and from what I've read on, like as you said, like Poland kind of trying to railroad Ukraine into letting them do the exhumations. Um, is that Ukraine kind of doesn't really have, you know considering everything that's happening in Ukraine right now,
Yes.
right? It's not exactly at liberty to just be like, oh yes, we're going to let another country's archaeological department or whatever come over here and just start doing these things, especially not without the fact that Poland, like, what has been kind of the view, at least from your own understanding, for why the Ukrainians see it as such an affront to their sovereignty, or if we are to even term it that way? I mean, I don't want to, misuse a phrase, but I kind of feel that like having that happen is kind of an issue of sovereignty, at least to some degree.
I'm not sure if it's even viewed that way. After all, during the statement, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine has said that Ukraine has no problem with the exhumation, but they want it to be a two-way street. They expect Poland
Right.
to commemorate the victims, the Ukrainian victims of various historical events that had affected them. So I'm not even sure if this is the problem necessarily at hand.
Okay. So then, I guess then what therefore seems to be like what would be then the path forward, right? Like what would be a two-way street from.
From my perspective, the way forward would be, as I've recently learned, honesty is the best policy. So, of course, the best way forward would be for both parties, Poland and Ukraine, to very bluntly recognize that certain things have happened in history, certain hurts have been done, that both sides have to recognize their part in doing wrong to the other, and both parties have to appropriately commemorate and appropriately note these historical events as facts to be then able to move forward from them.
Right. And so in that sense, how, I guess, well, when you're talking about recognition, right, that usually involves some amount of apology, some amount of, oftentimes remuneration, right? in terms of right trying to right the wrong in some way. Um, Especially since there was, at least ostensibly speaking, right, the process of what some people characterize as the Ukrainization, right, of that region. Um, so of Volhynia and Galicia. So in that sense, right, like how
Well, it's all,
how
of
should
course, very complicated considering that Ukraine and Poland have not been the only parties in this whole process. Like, you do have to
oh
also
yeah
remember that the USSR has been a huge contributor to um, Polish people being um, displaced, uh, deported, forcefully deported from places like Lviv and Vilnius for that matter. But Vilnius is a totally
yes.
different matter.
Right, much in the same way that like ethnic Germans were either sent, well, if they were if they were Germans that had already had communities pre-existing in Russia, a lot of them were sent to Kazakhstan. But if they were, you know, from later centuries and from later decades, then they would
I
just
personally think that
deport
it
them.
really depends on how. It depends on what sort of. Oh, how should I put it? What sort of parameters can both parties can agree upon? I don't think it necessitates big apologies or even big reparation. I think it necessitates mutual respect. It uh, definitely necessitates both parties recognizing what happened on both sides, and it
Mhm.
necessitates further sort of recognition of these events, be it through public commemorations, events, and things like that. And then moving on from these events.
Right, right. And so then the fact that so then that Ukraine hasn't, well, I mean, again, I agree that like both countries coming to an understanding and recognizing, because from what I understand, right, from the same, the parliament in Poland, right, that they've already, isn't it July 11th, the National Day of Remembrance, right, for the that particular, right, or am I confusing it with some other um date? But if I remember correctly, Poland already like has a day of remembrance for the victims of these massacres, right? Um, but Ukraine, in particular, has disputed this, as well as many, non-Polish historians,
Mm-hmm.
which is an issue, right? Uh, because there's always the question of, well, um, because there is, well, like there is an academic paper that's sort of by Ivan Kachanovsky. He actually he actually wrote an article that's titled "Ethnic Cleansing, Genocide, or Ukrainian Polish War in Volhynia," and in it he is contending, right, that like some people want to only have it be considered ethnic cleansing. Some people want to have it be classified as a genocide. Some people want to say it was just a war between two states, right?
Well,
And
the
so,
third one
and
is very difficult considering that at that point Poland hardly existed as an official state.
right, and I completely agree, right? And it's more so
And of course,
to
OUN itself was not actually an official arm of a Ukrainian state. So,
right, and again, it's because of the technicalities of like, oh well, there was the the Ukrainian state of the Carpathians, right? You know, like technically there was a Ukraine. It just wasn't all of Ukraine. It was just this one part. And so, and this is why again it's so fraught with issues, right? So, what of the two classifications besides the war one, then what would you? And again, I'm only asking just out of curiosity, um, because I've read his work, um, and again, he's written quite a lot on this topic, as has also the historian Jarek McBride. But he takes a very Jared McBride takes a very like I mean the title kind of says it all. It's literally peasants into perpetrators. So it like he calls it an ethnic cleansing. But I wonder if you think that recognizing it as an ethnic cleansing or genocide, right? If that would be a way to, I guess, I mean, besides allowing for the exhumation and all of that stuff that they want to have, as a way to finally put it, so to speak, in the past, right? By like naming it, saying it, and actually just like because you mentioned acknowledging it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But my question is like I feel that once you kind of give it a name, so to speak, right? It kind of then can be studied and then can be contextualized, whereas right now it's still I mean the fact that there are people who want to argue that it was a war between Ukrainians and Poles, which doesn't make any sense considering what the events that happened in Galicia and in Virginia. So I guess to me that would be the question then. Like that's why earlier I brought up apologies, because then that would mean that Ukraine would be making the apology to Poland, right? And I feel that like with everything going on, that's not exactly the type of, or at least that's the expectation, right? Like it doesn't matter if the Ukrainian state as such didn't exist, because it was in the sort of nascent form of what it now is, and is part of its history, right? It has to answer for that history, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
I
do
mean,
you?
it would depend. It would depend because I'm not entirely sure if I would classify the Volyn massacre as a genocide myself, which is very interesting considering that I had a whole argument about it with a Ukrainian person who said that, in her opinion, it definitely was a genocide. So we found ourselves in a situation in which a Polish person was saying that a thing that I'm not sure if the thing was a genocide, Volyn massacre, and the Ukrainian person was saying, "Oh yeah, it definitely was." So, you know.
Yes. And another thing that another chatter on Twitch is noting is Poland quote might want to get rid of the laws that indulge, and I believe they mean Poland, racist, homophobes, and anti-Semites on one hand, and on the other, to prosecute quote unquote communists, foreigners,
Prosecute
historians,
communists?
publishers. Uh, I I think I'm gonna let them reword that because I don't know how they mean that. It's to prosecute communist foreigners, historians, publishers, and witnesses of the Holocaust as well.
Pros-
Um,
I
oh, I see. Laws that prosecute
communists?
communists.
There are no laws that prosecute communists that I know of.
I suppose I think what they're trying. And I don't know if this is again, but isn't it it isn't like the Communist Party of Poland, like isn't it outright banned at this point?
I don't think so. No.
No? Okay. Because I know that I think in Ukraine it is banned, but that is also because the party that was created after the fall of the Soviet Union, much like the one that exists in Russia, didn't have anything to do with the one that existed during the Soviet Union. So, um,
Yeah, in Poland there's a legal communist party, yeah,
okay,
which is
um,
accepted by the Polish some Warsaw court.
okay, yeah, no, I just wanted to make sure because but I am interested though in what the
Hold
charter
on.
means by prosecute communists. Like to give more context in that. And then they also say, let's be honest, the entire world has yet to actually reconcile with fascism. Well, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, that's the reason why it's still with us. It
Sorry,
never
can
went
you can you
away.
can you repeat?
They said, or rather, the chatter said, um, let's just be honest. The entire world has yet to actually reconcile with fascism. Case in point, it's its rise in much of Europe, the United States, India, etc. today.
Well, I'm not sure. I think it's more complicated than that. I've already talked about it when I spoke of Germany and the rise of its AfD party. Is it?
Yeah, the Alternative for Deutschland. Yeah.
Yeah, that it's not necessarily as much as reconciling, because that actually assumes that countries, states, groups of people are these monolithical organisms that just reconcile with a thing once and then it's done. It's finished for good. It's basically a similar thing like with democracy. Oh, we've won democracy. I guess democracy is here. It's done. We don't ever have to do anything for it ever again. We are in the clear. We're safe. But it does not work like that. It's a constant it's a constant fight. You have to constantly sort of make sure that democracy is preserved. Democracy, once gained, can always be taken away, just as just because a form of totalitarianism, a form of fascism, or even Nazism was toppled in a place, or even some form of sort of um, active fight against this sort of ideology, it does not follow that this sort of ideology will never rise again. It does
Hmm.
not. There is no way to just reconcile with a thing and it's now done away with forever. It will never rear its ugly head again. It's gone. It ceased to exist as a thing. Because people will have certain awful beliefs. People will, with those awful beliefs, will form groups. They will try to get into power. And it is a constant fight not to let them. There's no one fix that will make those groups never try to rise again, ever again. It's just not
Right.
a realistic look at the
Hmm.
situation, in my opinion.
Well, well, I mean, again, I think in line with that, I think that like that is, I I I agree with you in the sense that yes, the idea like I mean, and again, I'm not exactly sure how the chatter meant, reconcile. I don't know if they meant it in one single instance. I don't know. I'll wait for them to respond. But one thing I do want to say though is that um, going back to like how one and this is kind of like a question I guess only you can really answer is like how how are these things which happened in Bohemia and Galicia, right? Like how are these things taught in Poland? I'm actually very curious. Like how are they taught to Polish people, right? Like when they're in school.
It's thought as an effect of ultranationalism of the groups in question.
Okay.
Of course,
And
there's also the, as always, it gets more complicated because
Sure.
And of course, that's something that's maybe not necessary. It depends, of course, on the party in charge, which will enforce certain curriculum norms into school. The Law and Justice Party would enforce a much more Polish nationalism point of view, which would underplay certain elements that even led to the rise of the OUN in the first place. And those elements are also taught, also present in uh, historical literature within Poland. These sort of There has been a very nice lecture that I've attended by a historian who said all history should be taught from the perspective of the minority groups that live within said countries. So let's take, for example, the historian actually gave the example of the Second Polish Republic. If you were a Ukrainian person living in that country, would you be able to feel safe? Would you be able to feel welcome? Ask yourself that, and then you can go from there when analyzing historical events.
It's very interesting that you posed that question because I was speaking to someone recently who was oddly enough saying that that they had been on social media, right, particularly TikTok, and they are Mexican as well, and that on TikTok that they kept saying, oh, the Spanish people, right, in Spain, right, if they find out that you're Mexican by your accent or whatever, right, that then they start to treat you really, really poorly. And again, this is not exactly the perfect, analogy, but it just came to my mind right now that you were describing that. But it was funny because this person lives in the United States, and I told them, and I kind of tried to reason with them this. It's like, you're afraid of them, like, oh, that they're going to be rude to you and blah blah blah, and yet you live in the United States, which is like the country that is perhaps the most unsafe, right, for a Mexican immigrant, to be in at this moment, right, where people are always and in fact, the United States has a history of mass expulsions of Mexicans, right? Like in the 1930s, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm saying, like, that history, it's there, but you're concerned about people being rude to you in Madrid, So I think, to me, that question is really interesting because it's also a very situational question as well, right? Like there are some people where they kind of almost, because of trauma, right? I mean, I don't want to use a clinical term lightly, but because of traumatic events in history, right, have that have either been like under taught or whatever it might be, right, kind of put a lot of their concerns that should be at the forefront, right, kind of be behind them, in the back of their minds, and then end up, not realizing, right, that they are in a really bad situation, right, all things considered. So yeah, and I mean to say this to agree with what you're saying, right, that, like, yes, if you were to be in that specific situation, right, with this context, and this is why for historians context is everything, um would you feel comfortable, being there? And the answer would, I mean, in many cases, right? Like, living in Berlin in 1935, probably not. And you're Jewish, probably not. Like, that's not a place you want to be. Um, for example, but like Poland, like Warsaw in the 1870s, yeah, you know what I mean. So it's like it's this really interesting situational aspect that fascinates me. But now I'm just going beyond the point.
Right.
So then how would
I probably will have to finish soon. I apologize.
oh, okay, then if you want, I will let you go, just because I don't want to keep you any longer than I already have, because again, thank you so much for being so accommodating.
No,
I
no, no,
really
it's fine.
appreciate
It's
it.
perfectly fine. It is perfectly fine. Do you have any Last questions for me?
No, no, I mean, like, I'm definitely sure that we can discuss this a bit more in depth some other time for sure. Again,
Okay.
I don't want to keep you from getting your sleep in because I know that it's really really late over there in Poland. So,
Or really early, if you will.
or really early, yeah, technically, yeah.
All
Okay,
right.
have a good night, and to your chat also, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate
Yes.
you talking with me.
Thank you, and bye bye.
Bye bye.
Okay.